Hello, I'm Chantal Doucette and welcome to Inclusion Podcast. In this episode, we are joined by Joanna Rawbone from Flourishing Introverts. We have a really fantastic conversation for you to listen to. Can't wait for you to hear and your thoughts.
Inclusion.
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 Inclusion. Inclusion.
Inclusion podcast by the Centre for Inclusive Leadership.
So, Joanna, thank you so much for joining us. I do need to kind of introduce you properly and read out, your CV because it's really impressive. You've had this lifelong career where you've just curiosity has been in the word for you, right?
Yeah.
It's been the thing you've been searching for, or the thing that helps you find the things you're looking for is that curiosity. And the prospect of possibility and gratitude. I thought that was just really striking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And actually, purposeful curiosity is one of my business principles now. And it gives me an excuse and a reason to keep asking questions, to keep exploring things and never just to settle. So, yeah.
I wonder if we're going to find out Joe's a coach.
Well, among other things, you're the founder of Flourishing Introverts.
Mm-hmm.
I watched a wonderful TED Talk that you did. Yeah, it was really insightful. I'm a high I on the
Right.
Myers-Briggs. So when I saw it, you gave me language and understanding of myself in a way that I just never had before. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And so, yes, coaching and training, consultancy. And you have a very loyal kind of international client base, which is fantastic. And you do work, which is quite aligned with really the centre, is about, enabling people to set themselves free from limiting beliefs, getting them to enhance their own sort of natural talents and optimise potential, which is incredible. I mean, for those who haven't seen it, they've got to watch the TED Talk, don't they?
We'll put the link on.
Yes.
Thank you. It was the most terrifying thing I've done, and we might talk about that later. So.
Oh my gosh.
It's really funny. I must say, we will get to it, but I was smiling because I was thinking to myself, yeah, as an introvert, this must be your worst nightmare. But by the way, you absolutely aced it. It was great. It was not only was it great content, it was brilliant delivery as well. So
Thank you.
it was really, really good.
It was wonderful. So we're just going to start with you because we're here with you. We want to know more about you, and we always kind of start with what's your story, what's your inclusion story. So just to give viewers a bit or listeners an idea about you.
Yeah. Thank you.
So just as a bit of give you a moment to think about this. It's interesting because some of our viewers coming maybe for the first time. When we talk about inclusion, we think about the distinction between diversity and inclusion. So to us, diversity is a fact, right?
Yeah.
And inclusion is about how you feel about your facts. And so Chantal's question is a lovely question because essentially it's this: how do you feel, or how are you made to feel about being you? What's your inclusion story?
And there is quite a story, actually.
I bet.
I knew, and I talk about this in the TEDx as well, but I knew I was different from some of my family members, from sister, etc., because I love to take myself to bed early to read at the end of my school day. And it resulted in me being called all sorts of rather unkind names, and we may talk about those later as well. And it wasn't until my 30s that I realised what made me different was that I identified as an introvert. And I know people knock Myers-Briggs, but the first time I completed that and saw the little paragraph that was like, that's me to a T. And for the first time I thought, so I'm not weird, I'm not broken, I don't need fixing. There are other people like me. However, and this is the inclusion bit, I guess, in a way, all it did was highlight the difference between kind of how introverts behave and how extroverts typically behave. So I now had a blueprint for how I should be, because in the world of training, learning and development, emceeing big events, etc., speaking at conferences, they all seem to be these big characters who were entertainers rather than kind of real thought leaders necessarily. So I realized that what I thought what I needed to do was to be more like them. So I then spent nearly 2 decades pretending to be something I wasn't in order to fit in and get on. And also during that time, I'd received lots of feedback about push yourself forward, speak up more, you've got to contribute more, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, all of which was sending messages that it's not okay to be you. You need to be something else. And eventually I hit burnout, because I'm surprised I sustained it for nearly 2 decades. So my introvert burnout was a painful period of my life, and took me 3 months to even start to work through it. And if I can stop anyone going that route because they feel it's not okay to be themselves, then that's what my work's about.
You want to start?
I
Or
mean,
shall I do?
there's so much,
The pick on, right?
yeah,
Go, you
and the
jump. Go ahead.
fitting
I'll
in
follow.
point as well. And I just find it so interesting about, you had this blueprint
Yeah.
of how you should be, and use the word should,
Yes.
but then went completely the other way. And because you weren't allowed, it was what you were, it's the signaling, what you were told,
Yeah.
whether it was directly, covert or overtly, those were the signals of the messages, and actually, people pushing you to be a certain way that you weren't. And I think that's so interesting that you, just that point of finding that gold, having that connection, and then having that immediately taken away from you.
And it's interesting, because if I was to describe it, I don't know that it was taken away. It's almost like I buried it.
Okay.
So I buried the gold that I'd been given, because that was and would have been an ideal opportunity for me to say, so these are typically the things that I bring to the party. How can I really own those and play to those strengths? But I didn't. I buried that until my 50s.
Yeah, but I think this is such an interesting point, because I think that's what's so pervasive about this stuff. Because you're right, the real robbery is it's self-robbery.
Yeah,
There's a reason why people talk in our world about masking and concealing and hiding,
absolutely.
because the need to belong is so strong.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, I think it's Susan Cain in her book Quiet.
Yes.
Does she talk about the what's her phrase she uses? The extrovert ideal, or the ideal extrovert, or something. So
The extrovert ideal,
the
yeah.
extrovert ideal, that's right. So this notion of actually good people are like this, to the point you've just made.
Yeah.
So and then there's this really compelling point that you've just made, and Chantal would have smart, because it's a big thing. We talk about the idea of fitting in versus fitting together. And once anybody has to start fitting in, that's always about editing, isn't it? It's all about self-editing.
Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting. But what I'm really intrigued about with this conversation, of course, is when we talk about aspects of one's social identity, typically it's obvious to have conversations about visible social identity stigmas, be it gender, or be it race, or something. But when you start dealing with invisible stigma, this is actually very interesting. You'll remember our conversation with Pamela when she was talking with us last time, Chantal, about menopause and so on. We had that fascinating conversation. So I think this is great ground for us to work on, because where we will be joined hand in hand would be on this notion of, and our work is about fundamentally giving people back to themselves, which we think is perhaps the greatest gift of them all. And through all the noise, the ability to just be yourself in the midst of a world that seems to demand that you be anything other than yourself feels to us a really key part, because at its heart for us, inclusion is about belonging. And what belonging generates, or should generate, I think, is it should generate authenticity. So it should enable me to be authentically who I am, because we've all been in environments where we're not being ourselves and we think we belong. Well, you don't belong, because it's not you showing up. So how do you belong? Because it's not you, right?
Absolutely. And there's an example of that, really. And my heart sunk when I heard that there are now interview coaches who coach people how to respond in an interview as more extroverted. And then, of course, if they're successful, a few days or a week or so into the role, and the manager goes, who is that person? That's not who we recruited, because it's not sustainable. And, one of the things I think interview coaches should be doing is really helping people understand what their natural strengths and gifts are, so that that's what we bring to the party. And then we need interviewers who are skilled enough to see actually, how we fit together, how we complement each other.
Well, it's key, right? Because the point you make, I think it's the title of your talk is about extrovert bias. And the problem is, in interviewing, what happens is, when you have people who are let's do it this way, people who are extroverts or think they should be,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Which is the other issue, right?
Yeah.
Are starting to interview. They're looking for that, so they have an affinity bias and
Yeah.
for that. So if you want that role, here's how you have to show up. And I agree with you. I think that's massively problematic. And the thing that really interests me was the point that you made in your talk, and it's like, oh my goodness, if 50% of people are introverted,
Yeah.
that means there's a 1 in 2 chance if the person you're sitting in front of is an introvert and quite potentially not actually being who he or them or they think they are, right? Which
Absolutely.
is interesting. I just wanted to go back quickly on Myers-Briggs actually, just to touch that, because I thought that was just worth referencing.
Mm.
Because I agree with your point about some people take a view on that, but I think it's worth just remembering that those psychometric tools, they're there for a purpose. And I think if you take anything psychometric or anything from anybody
Yeah.
else externally and use it to define you, I think that's a mistake. I think what those tools do, and they do it well, is they help to describe you. And they
Absolutely.
describe a personality, they describe a temperament set.
Mm.
And if you recognize it, great. If you don't recognize it, just let it sit. But what you shouldn't do with those tools, I think where they become unhelpful, is if you then say, I'm a,
Yes.
and so then people get really, really behind, I'm a red,
Yeah.
or if they've done insights, or I'm a this, if they've done Myers-Briggs, and I just kind of ask people to be careful about that. The being authentically who you are is super, super important.
I certified with an MBTI because I was so blown away
Yeah.
by the fact how much it resonated with me.
Yeah, I bet.
And one of the things I remember so clearly from the training was your type does not define you, but your type also does not excuse your behavior.
That's nice.
And there's
That's a
something,
lovely point.
it is. And when we're using anything like that in leadership, for me, it's about how do I flex my behavior to bring out the best of people so that it's not this is who I am, and what you see is what you get. For me, it's actually about leaders taking time to know their people, to understand what makes their people tick so that they can flex and create that inclusive culture for people.
For sure. And this is the reason why we talk about the idea, Joe, of the leader treats everybody equally well. And that's not treating
Same as
everybody
equally.
the same, right?
Yeah,
That's not the
exactly.
same, right?
Exactly.
Same treatment and equal treatment, different ideas. And I think particularly the point you've just made reminds me, I was doing a webinar with a group the other day, and I was talking about this idea. Somebody said, so really the trick is to treat people the way that you want to be treated. And I
No.
went, no, maybe not. Right? That's the gold standard, perhaps, but the platinum standard is to treat people the way that
they want to
that's
be
right.
treated.
That's
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely. And that means that I take the management and leadership of people seriously. And quite often, because I still deliver management training, I will say to people, if the management of people is seen like an adjunct and an inconvenience, you shouldn't be taking the money for a manager's role, because it is largely about how do I manage that team of people so that they can deliver of their best, so that they can be at their best.
100%. You're around next week. The reality is that when you're an individual contributor, it's about what you can produce, right? And you succeed through your own efforts. But when you're a manager, you succeed through the efforts of other people.
Absolutely.
So the whole idea is about how you can enable, elevate. Now that's entirely what our business model is based on.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Chantal, I wonder, can we tease some questions out about the difference perhaps between the introvert and the extrovert? Because I think that's quite an interesting subject, right?
Yeah, I think you've just asked it.
There you go. Then. Well, let's leave it. Let's leave it asked.
I'll go with that. So I'm a Jungian at heart, and I go back to the original Jungian definition, which is that an introvert is somebody who is already overstimulated mentally, and so they go inward, hence the intro bit, in order to recharge. So we can all behave however we choose, provided we've got that charge in our batteries. But the difference between the introvert and the extrovert is that the introvert will go internally to recharge, which is why if you've got introverts in your circle, and you will have, because up to 50% of any population, they'll often just disappear from a dinner or a party or a meeting. And it's like, hello, where's Jo gone? And those that know me will go, she's gone for a quick recharge. Because we literally, it's like watching the battery drain on our phones, and it's like, critically low, need to go and do something. The extroverts, of course, also have those battery charging needs, but they get theirs recharged by external stimulation. They need that interaction in order to recharge. So we can understand then why extroverts love being in a busy, bustling office, because there's chat and banter and there's something busy going on all around them. And the introverts are going, please just stop so that I can focus. So again, the extroverts can behave in a more quiet way if they choose to, but they need that interaction in order to recharge in the same way that we need the quiet in order to recharge. I have a bit of an analogy, which is that for me, the introvert almost, when their battery's going low, they kind of sidle up to a plug socket, plug themselves in, and just kind of, I'm here quietly until I'm recharged. Whereas the extrovert, it's more like they have a solar panel, and all the while there's something going on, they're drawing that and creating energy from it. So they're almost on trickle charge all the while they're in society, all the while they're in a busy environment. But put them in a library and they wouldn't be happy.
It's so interesting. And also when watching the TED Talk, you talk about neurodivergence. Now, I have not, or neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And I've not heard that link made before. And that was something that really unlocked something inside of me to hear that, because then I went, oh, I think I really make sense. That made more sense of myself hearing that. And I just wonder if you could just talk a bit more about the connection, because your point was well made that we live in an extroverted culture. And so those that are introverted, we need to really look at how do we care for those people and set them up in a way that they can function and thrive just as well as those in a extroverted in spaces. But the neurodivergence, that I thought was fascinating. I'd never heard that before.
And the reason that I started using the term that introversion is a neurodiversity is, let's face it, we're all neurodiverse. No two brains are the same anyway, so we all are all wired slightly differently.
That's good.
And the functional neuroimaging studies show that the brains of introverts and extroverts light up differently when stimulated in the same way. So actually there must be something there. So my phrase I use now is, I'm not weird, I'm wired differently. And that I kind of use to counter some of the myth and misunderstandings that are often leveled at introverts, often attribution bias. You're quiet, you keep your head down, you don't need much leader or management time, therefore you lack ambition. It's like, no, that's not true at all. Not true at all. So and there's another thing. Christine Fonseca was doing some research. I haven't followed it up recently, but what she was finding was that extroverts tend to use that dopamine that most of us are used to thinking about in terms of kind of motivation and reward and stuff. Whereas the introvert brains seem to prefer acetylcholine, which is the power down chemical. So when we feel good and are motivated, it's not dopamine that does it for us. It's the power down acetylcholine, which I find fascinating.
So that's really interesting, because I do a lot of work on my own. So it kind of does help me in that way.
Yeah.
But when I get really creative, it's when I'm listening to like binaural beats.
Yes.
So I'll put on those sounds and I'll just have them on like underneath, and that just helps to really focus me in, and I can just get lost for a few hours just doing that.
Yeah.
So that's interesting about that. So I mean, sounds obviously are going to be something that's going to help and have an impact on introversion.
Absolutely.
Stimulation.
And finding the sound. And that's why a lot of introverts like wearing headphones too, either in the workplace, and of course it's frowned on in quite a lot of workplaces because people think, they're not working because they're listening to music. But in the same way that we know some people doodle when they're really focusing and listening, the same thing applies in terms of if I need to drown out that that chatter. Because one of the things introverts tend not to like is the mindless chatter. We want those deep, meaningful, generative kind of conversations.
Yeah.
So if music or beats like the binaural beats really work for us, then I think we should really allow that in some ways. But I want to do some research because I have this kind of hypothesis forming, which is that I think probably introverts get into flow easier, provided they're in the right environment, because we don't need that stimulation. So actually to get into that space and lose ourselves for a while. And I'd love to do some research around that.
That's fascinating. I mean,
And it's only a hypothesis, of course.
I'm sure there's something in that. I mean, I can think back to being in a room not that long ago where people just walked in and they were all just saying hi, but they hadn't seen each other for a while. So it was quite performative chatter, and it just went really high. And the pitch, it was like this frequency, and I could feel myself withdrawing from the room.
Yeah.
And my friend said, "Are you okay?" And I can't. When it reaches a certain decibel and they're not talking to each other, they're talking at each other and across each other, but it's really loud and it's performative, I completely disassociate.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. And it's why I rarely attend as a delegate big conferences, because and part of the training I've done was with a kind of female only organization, and they hold these annual conferences of kind of 400 or 500 women. And there's something for me about the female voice when it gets really high that I can't deal with, and especially in numbers like that.
I know.
Yes, I'm completely with you on that.
I'm staying out of this.
We're allowed to talk
but
about.
I'm very interested in what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because a couple of things that are on my mind as you're talking. One is to do with, I'm thinking about the performative world in which we all work in one way or another. And I was thinking about the idea of when I facilitate, for example, one of the things I will often say when I facilitate, particularly when you do it remotely, because remote's even more complicated because you don't have that, because I like the energy of the room, right? So when you don't have that energy and it's kind of distanced from you by this virtual digital space, and you might put an idea out there. My instinct when I seed something into a conversation is I expect people to be like fish when you drop, when you drop food into the thing, you overtake it. That's my instinct, because that's what I do when people generate ideas to me.
Yeah.
So I'll often say during a facilitation, just so you're all aware what's going on, right? I have no idea what we're doing now because I don't understand quite. I presume is thinking, but that means that I don't understand. So I'm so confused at the moment because to me, I don't. I mean, I know you'll smile because I know this is what you think. I have no idea what I think about something until I talk about it. So I'll start. I might go, "What do you think?" And I don't know. I'll go, "Oh yeah, yeah." And I'll be talking along going, "Yeah, that's a good idea." And then my brain will go, "That's an excellent idea." And then I'll go off and march off and do something.
Right.
Whereas people that just sit and think, they totally confuse me because I don't know what they're doing.
And that tends to be the communication process of the introvert. So we
For sure.
we tend to have this, what I refer to, and on my TED Talk, you'll see me doing it, this kind of think, say, think communication process. And it's, that's where in interview, for instance, if we're not given time and space to think about our answer, and I've seen it happen where, there's a pause and the interviewer's making notes, and it's like, what are you writing? That they took too long to answer, that they don't know that they're like lack confidence. What are you writing in that moment? Because I doubt it's that they're really reflective and thought about the answer. I doubt that a lot of the interviewers are writing that. Whereas the more extroverted types have this say, think, say, and it is more like a stream of consciousness.
100%. I completely own that. Although I want to talk to you about this introvert extrovert thing in a minute, but I completely own that. For me, it's just stream of consciousness, and I drive people crazy with it because I'll go, and the problem is I'll say something, I'll think something, and I'll think it in such a, I don't know, how should I say this? Such a resolved way, and then 2 minutes later I might go, nah.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that is quite.
And of course,
that's kind of just my you've seen me do that, right?
Yeah.
That's my process. And you'll think this is like, he's really worked on this. And then I'm like, no, I haven't. It just came from somewhere.
And of course, the challenge with that is that because we like to be certain about what we're going to say before we say it, typically, it takes us longer to get there. we then are quite attached to what we're saying.
Yeah. See, I'm not.
Yes.
Right. That's so
And you may
funny,
not
isn't it?
even remember what you said. In
There's a
some
very
cases.
good chance that I won't remember, unless it's brilliant, in which case I'll go, oh,
Yeah.
most of it's rubbish, so I don't remember most of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to recognize those kind of two different processes. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong, they're just different. So let's create space for both of those, and let's understand that, you know, one type of person isn't being difficult. It's just we have different processing
Yeah.
methods.
But this is kind of where I want you to help me a little bit, because the thing you've helped me with is recognizing that it's not left and right-handed, is it? Right.
No.
So it's not like, oh, you're left-handed, therefore you're a whatever. You're right-handed, therefore you're the other one. It's more it's more nuanced than that, right? Because,
Absolutely.
for example, I remember from your talk, you talked about this engaging introvert, which I thought was a really interesting idea. So this is the notion, if I heard you correctly, of an introvert that's perfectly happy on a stage, can have hundreds of people at their command,
Yep.
and they're good. There's no problem
Yep.
with that. And you would go, hold on, I don't understand that. How's that possible? So it's not quite as binary, is it, of saying you're either this or you're that. There's
No.
almost this sort of kind of neuroambidextrous behavior, right? Where do you know what I mean? There's feels like, is that right or wrong?
It is, absolutely. And it comes back to this point that we can't say that introversion is a set of behaviors, because we can all choose to behave in different ways.
And that's the choice is important, isn't it?
Absolutely. But what it does require is that I've got enough charge in my battery in order to be able to stand on the stage and kind of, you know, have some kind of magnetic energy about me. I can't do it when I'm depleted.
So just on that, so
Yeah.
are you saying then, to your Jungian point, that if we wanted to define something,
Yeah.
in so much as we don't necessarily need to nail it down, but to
Yeah.
help us to bucket it, you're essentially saying the difference is the introvert goes in, the extrovert goes out.
Absolutely.
That is actually quite helpful, isn't it?
Mhm.
That's helpful. So
Mm.
for instance,
Yeah.
because this is actually a very good point, to take your phone metaphor, I can be exhausted. I can be completely and utterly exhausted, and then the light goes on, and I'm off. Off I go.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I've got nothing.
Yeah.
Fumes.
Yeah.
But I'm good now because
Really?
100%.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
100%.
So you're feeding off the energy
Yeah,
of the
100%.
audience.
It doesn't. It's no issue whatsoever. It doesn't matter. I
Yeah.
don't prepare. I don't need to nothing. No,
Wow.
never need to do that.
That's quite incredible.
Yeah.
But it's just different, right?
It
It's
is.
your
Yeah,
neuroscience,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And so for introverts who do have access to those kind of extroverted type behaviors, like being able to command an audience, being able to be on stage, or introverts who are great networkers, because if you're a sociable introvert, you actually enjoy those kind of, you know, little chit chats and which.
That whole butterflying thing
Oh,
does my head in. I'm
absolutely.
sorry, forgive me. That's just, I can't do that.
But sociable introverts quite like that.
I don't like that.
So imagine then, rather than just being a classic introvert, which is almost everything we would imagine an introvert to be, I'm now somebody who has access to 3 or 4 or even 5 of these different
I like
types.
I like this.
Then people are going to go, there's no way you're
Yeah, I
an
think
introvert.
that's
I've
really
seen you at networking. I've seen you MC events. I've seen you do X. I've seen you do Y. But what they don't see is the pre-charging I have to do beforehand and the recharging I have to do afterwards.
And what they're also not factoring in is their prejudice
Absolutely.
concerning what an introvert is and what a bias is.
Absolutely.
And particularly if Kane's point about the extrovert ideal is right, that's really, really, and one that I have to aspire to as well. Tell me a bit about this. So I'm interested in thinking, because a lot of the people that will watch our podcast are practitioners, right?
Yeah.
So they may be L&D practitioners. Obviously, they're going to be D&I practitioners. So a lot of industry people that watch our stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm thinking to myself as we're talking is, what happens when we're trying to support managers, right? Because I guess the more and more I do this work, the more and more I think to myself, the best gift we can give to an organization, apart from giving people back to themselves, is giving them better managers, right?
Yeah.
That feels like
100%,
the
yeah.
best thing we could ever do. Let me give you a better manager.
Yeah.
And I don't mean by replacing the manager. I just mean by enabling that manager to find themselves,
Yeah.
to give that manager back to themselves. But I'm wondering to myself, what happens in the case, let's say, of, or is it different? But here's what I'm asking. So let's say I'm extroverted
Yeah.
and I'm working and facilitating groups.
Yeah.
Is it easier or different for me as an extrovert to be able to facilitate groups rather than it is for an introvert? Because for the extrovert, what I'm always wondering about doing, and I'm not entirely sure I'm so extroverted, but anyway, that's the
Yeah. Yeah.
second point. But I'm always alive to bringing people into conversations and wanting to hear and make sure everyone in the room's heard. And I'm always wanting to test things, and that's nice. I'm very happy to risk things. I imagine the introvert would be a bit more circumspect, a bit more cautious than that. So does one start an advantage, or how does it calibrate to help the introvert to overcome that? If indeed it's something to overcome,
Yeah.
maybe actually I need to be quieter, which might be a better idea.
And it's not necessarily something to be overcome, but
Mhm.
I think it is something to be really mindful of.
Yeah.
And it takes me straight back to that story again. I think I share in the TED talk where I was, although already a trainer and coach, I was a delegate on a course, and a very extroverted trainer who was really good, I have to say, asked me a question. I did my think, say, think bit, and kind of literally, I think I probably, sat my chin on my hand. And he moved on, asked somebody else, never came back to me, and then gave me feedback at the end of the course that I was a low responder who lacked confidence. And it's like,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you see, see, that's interesting, isn't it?
Wow.
yeah. So there is something here about, for those practitioners, how do we, or how do they really notice who the quieter ones are, and then find ways, introduce processes that enable them to contribute in a way that they're comfortable to do so? Because it's not as simple as, Joe, you've been quiet, what is it you want to say now? Because actually that can be even worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think as facilitators, we need to get creative in our processes. So maybe we start brainstorming sessions, for instance, with, let's write ideas down on post-it notes, then get together in small groups to share what we've got, then see how that comes together. So it's about appealing to every type of personality rather than just appealing to those who are going to go, me, I've got an idea, kind of, and here's my stream of consciousness.
Yeah, because it's very easy then to just get attracted to that person as well, isn't it? Because there's that, you've got
Absolutely.
that rhythm, you've got that bounce with them.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think has been really helpful for introverts in the facilitation world we're living, kind of hybrid facilitation world. Of course, when we started, we were, oh, what was that, right? You were in classrooms, that was the
I
only thing
know,
you did.
absolutely.
What I have noticed is interesting is how active introverts are on chat.
Yes.
So if you might have you might be raising a conversation, you want to get views, and that'd be like crickets, they can hear nothing.
Yeah.
But if you say, put your hand up, there's like,
A few.
yeah, but it's crickets.
Not
most
much
stuff,
more
right?
than crickets.
But if you say, just pop something in the chat, then there's this kind of torrent of stuff that goes in the chat, and that's really helpful. And I found that to be a really useful way,
Yeah.
because now I can then choose to say, I can either choose to read it back for you,
Yeah.
or I can bring you into the conversation.
Yeah.
But I think it's a much easier way to work. But for me, that's your post-it note point, I think, is a nice one,
Yeah.
because I think it does the same sort of thing. But what about the introvert who's facilitating? What's the support for the introvert, the quiet person that likes to think, that's got to create this kind of engaged, kind of
Yeah.
excited, up environment? What do they do?
Well, it's interesting because as you're saying excited and up, I'm going, do we really need to create that kind of environment?
Fair.
Or actually, do we? Because what an introvert's natural preference here will be to create a reflective environment in which people start to look inwards and start to then bring forward what it is has resonated with them, what it
Yeah,
is
nice.
that's occurred, rather than necessarily the kind of the hypey excited thing. But I think we need an interesting cadence in there, in that we've got some of each. And maybe it's where we start. So possibly the extroverted facilitator trainer is going to start with the kind of, okay, guys, let's, and a bit of energy in the room. And maybe the introverted facilitator starts with the quieter, calmer, reflective, let's create some psychological safety here, that it's okay to be
That's
who
so
you are.
interesting. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's funny that because now I'm hearing potentially, I'm going to tease you a little bit, but now I'm hearing an
Yeah.
introvert bias, right?
Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
is funny, right? Because I think that there's I don't necessarily see this sort of jazz hands idea of the
No,
of the
I have seen that though.
yeah, and it makes you just want to run for cover, right? So
Absolutely.
I get that. I think what I really like is your cadence point, because I think that it's Chantal again. How much time do we spend holding space, creating psychologically safe
Mm.
environments? I think the thing I was trying to pull on. I talk about excited and up. What I mean is kind of energy levels are high and people are kind of engaged and they're lent
Yeah.
in, is what I kind of meant. Um, but I think it's interesting because what it suggests to me, and it's funny because I hadn't really thought about it like this, but when we do our facilitations with larger groups, we always have two facilitators and we match them up. And they don't tend to be two left feet or two right
Yeah.
feet. They
Yeah.
tend to be a left and a right. And I think there's something useful about that, because I think what happens then is you get that nice balance potentially. And I hadn't thought, Chantal, about, do we match introverts with extroverts? I hadn't really thought about it like that, but maybe we do. But what is interesting in there is again, let me go back to Susan Cain's book. She talks about that lovely example at the beginning of her book with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Do you remember in their story? And she's saying that actually Rosa Parks wouldn't have been able to kind of, say, I have a dream. But Rosa Parks was able to sit, and her quiet, introverted, powerful
Presence.
strength created the environment in which her fortitude, her stoicism was able to then be matched up with Martin Luther, who of course spoke at the rally, of course we all know,
Yeah.
right? And those two came together, which makes you think, actually, to your point, if there's 50% of the world is introvert, then isn't it about saying that we actually need each other? That the
Absolutely.
introvert needs the extrovert and the extrovert needs the introvert. I always think that with generational work. I always think that
Yes.
when I put younger people with older people, what I see happen is I see that older people kind of get an extension of their youth, and I think younger people get the benefit of wisdom. And I think
Yes.
that's beautiful. And I suspect there's those kinds of energies that to be had when the introvert and the extrovert come together, provided, and here may be a big problem, provided that the extrovert particularly can let their ego go, because the extrovert needs to be the kind of loudest voice in the room sometimes, right?
Yeah, and they will assume leadership. They,
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't
yeah,
it?
it is
That's the problem.
absolutely. So it's about, because typically we have that kind of slower delivery, and I've been called, and I think it was a compliment by an old colleague of mine, that I have a very considered delivery, and
Depends who said it.
yeah, exactly. And I recognize that it's true in me. So I think the other thing when we're working in pairs, because I absolutely agree with you, for me, this is not about further division.
It's not either or, is it?
No, this is about genuine inclusivity and valuing the differences that
That's
we
the
each
thing.
bring.
That's the thing.
And I am part of quite a few introvert communities, and all on Facebook, and all they do is complain about the extroverts. Now that's not helpful either. So
I
there's
don't
the
think it is.
there's the introvert bias.
That's
if
what
you
I'm saying. And I think
absolutely,
there is an introvert bias, right?
absolutely, and it's from people who are choosing to hold positions rather than explore the interests in the way we might do in negotiation. It's like, rather than I want this and I want that, or I'm right and you're wrong, or I'm right, whatever it is. It's about exploring that purposeful curiosity again.
Well, that's nice.
What is it that we both bring? How do we and why do we approach things the way we do? Because we may well get to the same end result, but we'll get there completely differently.
It's fascinating.
Good, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on something you picked up on this, a thread around Rosa Parks and Martin Luther. So thinking about the strengths of the introvert,
Sure.
what are they? And also, we get managers a lot saying, "Oh, I've got someone in my team who's quiet, who's introverted.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with them. I don't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
What do I do?"
Yeah.
And so it'd be interesting to hear what you think about what could help managers with somebody who is introverted in their team. And I'm saying, the way I've even positioned the question is as if extroversion is normal. Because I haven't even said extroverted manager. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's always said that way. Even I fall into that as an introvert myself. So
Yeah.
what are the strengths of the introverts, and what can extroverted managers do that struggle with introverted sort of team members?
I mean, the strengths of the introvert are many and varied because, again, we may be the engaging, sociable, connected introvert, or I may be a classic introvert. So even those are going to be different. But typically what we find is that introverts are great listeners. And in their listening, they will notice what's not being said as well as what's being said. And so they have an important role to play in a team where they may then assimilate the ideas, or they may actually highlight something towards the end that people hadn't noticed, or summarize or something. And because introverts are highly unlikely to say something that kind of doesn't need saying. So if somebody's already said it, it's like, well, job done. And so what we'll often hear in meetings is 3 or 4 people saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And an introvert's going, what's the point of that? It's been said.
Yeah.
So I think there is something here about, let's utilize that listening, that calm, quiet presence, because quite a lot of introverts are also good at diffusing drama and trauma and stuff in groups, because they kind of don't get caught up in it all. They don't contribute to it in some way. So they can be quite a calming influence. They're typically great researchers. They can be a bit of a dog with a bone, give them something and they will really pursue that. So when it comes to problem solving, they're more likely to be the ones that will keep going until they find the root cause, rather than applying sticking plasters to the presenting issue, for instance. And that's not to say extroverts don't have those qualities, but they're some of the things that introverts are typically kind of renowned for. And if you watch people like Matthew Pollard, who Australian, now lives in America, I think, who's a fire hose when it comes to, he talks about the introvert advantage or the introvert edge, I think it is, when it comes to networking and sales. And he says introverts make the best salespeople because they ask a question and really listen to the answer.
It's very powerful.
So they're not there to sell to you. They're there to understand what it is you want to buy, and they help you buy it.
It's really powerful. I very much agree with that, and I think to myself, I'm very conscious of the fact that when I'm working with groups, that I'm always long to hear what the quietest person in the room's got to say, because I think that it's Nancy Klein's point, right? Everything we do depends on the quality of thinking we do before we do it, right? And I think that's right. And I think that having that time to do that thinking is tricky. So it's funny because, just backing onto the point, Chantal, one of the things I think is important for managers, and I say this as one of the things I think is important is that sometimes the problem that you get with the extrovert, so your go in, go out point, sometimes the extrovert's problem is that they need to be not only externally charged, but they need to be externally validated. So what happens if the extrovert has presented something and it doesn't get a response, then the extrovert can be left thinking, don't you like it? Right? Isn't it good? And then that can put the extrovert into a tailspin. And actually, I've got through processes before where I've done, I've literally, I've like preached my soul out, it's like, and then you see people going, thank you. And you go, thank you. He's talking about thank you. And you go,
is that as deep as it went?
Is that it? Yeah. And you have to, I'm like going, what was wrong? And I think the thing that you have to realize as an extroverted manager, particularly, is that what extroverts call quiet is the sound of thinking.
Absolutely. And I think we're living and working in cultures that don't value thinking. We don't see it as work. We think if people are quiet and thinking, they're not working. Couldn't be further from the truth.
Go into stores in the West End, for example. Just anywhere you go, it's all noise. The more noise we can make, the more noise we can make, the better it will be.
Yeah.
But I think the lovely thing for me about that is, and I like your listening point, because for us, definitely, one of the biggest things that we teach from inclusive leadership is clean listening, right?
Yeah.
And nobody can listen in a clean way if they're not, if they're talking
or preparing
or
what they're going to say,
or whatever's going on. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
And I think the lovely thing about that for me, Jo, is that I think the great thing, I was told as a child, I'm sure you heard the same thing, empty vessels make the most sound.
Yes.
And I don't think that's true anymore. I think the truth is that empty vessels leave room for other people to make their sound.
Yeah.
And
What
I
a
think,
lovely, yeah, what a
and I
lovely
think
way of putting it.
that's the difference, isn't it? That the introvert is
Yeah,
able to be just at the service of the person that and that's all we do, whether you're introvert or extrovert. Use whatever you have to
yes,
be in service of elevating what it is to be human in the workplace. And
yeah,
if all the levers, if you've got are extroverted levers, then pull them, but pull them gently.
yeah,
And equally, if your levers are introverted levers, pull them gently. But we're all trying to do the same thing.
yeah,
We're trying to elevate what it is to be human in the workplace, right?
absolutely agreed. And back to Chantal, your point about the managers, there are several things that people have said to me about, because meetings can be a problem, where spontaneous meetings with no agenda in particular, and let's just think out loud about this, let's get creative, doesn't give the introvert time to actually think about their
Right.
thoughts about something. And one of the people I'm coaching at the moment said, what I've now done is, if it's a decision-making meeting, I'll say to them, I'm leaving this open till the end of the day. If you have any further reflections on it, just pop them into me by the end of the day, and then we
Nice.
can make up. And it's like, it's as simple as that. That's all it needs, is rather than thinking we have to make this decision here and now without giving people that time to think, give people that reflection time. Let's start applauding thinking time. Let's bring it back into fashion, I say.
That sounds like a good idea. Thank you so much for having spent this time with us. I have one last question
Of
for
course.
you. So what, and we've talked around this, you talked about it a bit, but what is it? Extraversion bias. And why is it important that we work to reduce it, do you think, in society, in terms of creating that inclusion?
There's very little actually written about the extraversion bias. I've written a couple of things, a couple of other people have. And for me, it's a cocktail of other bias that kind of comes together in a fairly unhealthy way. So whether it's affinity bias, attribution bias, and these days things like proximity bias, where we think more highly of and give more opportunities to the people who are in the office, because clearly they're serious about their career, whereas the people who are still preferring to work from home, aren't committed, and they're, you'll hear all this sort of stuff going on. And so I think for me, the extraversion bias is any practice or process, and they are embedded throughout organizations, that doesn't enable an introvert to play to their strengths, to be themselves, back to that inclusion piece. They can't be themselves, so they're either pretending or kind of putting on a brave front and dealing with it, rather than managers, leaders, the cultural specialists saying, how do we enable the quieter folk to really flourish?
Wow. Do you know what, Shan? I know we've got to close, but that summary is beautiful. You got to come back. I was just thinking to myself as Joe was talking. See, I wasn't listening because I'm thinking. I was just thinking to myself, it's funny. As a child, I was told that children are supposed to be seen and not
Me
heard,
too.
right?
Yeah.
But what you said makes me think to myself, I wonder if the extrovert is saying to the child who's grew up with that, actually, if you want to be seen, you've got to be
Be
heard.
heard. They do. They do.
Fascinating.
Good stuff, right?
Well, thank you so much. We definitely want to have you back on.
Oh, I want to come back because I feel like there's a whole lot more still to explore.
We got to do the RTO stuff. We've got to do that because I think that is a big, big subject that will resonate with our people.
Absolutely.
Folks. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I've loved it. I've absolutely loved it. So thank you.